So, a little bit of a backstory. So, back in the early 90s, a new comic imprint was launched through DC Comics, and it was quite a unique, pioneering kind of imprint. And it was Milestone, which was created by Dwayne McDuffie, Dennis Cowan, Michael, can't remember his name, and I think James Illich, and there's about 3 or 4 other people. They all got together and they wanted to do a comic company that promoted diversity, ethnicity-wise, gender-wise. Have more female characters, female writers, sexuality-wise as well. And it'd never been done before. This was, obviously you had companies like Vertigo. You had the imprint like Vertigo, which was pushing boundaries for grown-up adult comics, but for like mainstream superhero comics, it was unheard of. You had like your token black characters like Luke Cage, Black Lightning, etc. You could literally count black characters or other ethnicities on one hand, or at the most on about 8 fingers for each company. So this was brilliant. It was a company run by black creators, Asian creators, LGBTQ creators, so they could portray they could write about characters that they related to, and that a vast majority of the population could relate to, that had normally been just given like little tidbits, and especially people from on the margins, like the LGBTQ area. There's little subtle inroads for that as well. For example, Blood Syndicate, they had a few characters that were gay in it, and there was one character in that was trans-masked, but that was before transgenderism was really talked about. It was very, very, the words what they used back then you wouldn't use nowadays. But this is a very long and convoluted way to say that this was what we jump ahead now. So it's been around about a year now. So I'm in the comic shop in 1994. I did not look like this. I looked more like a wannabe Kurt Cobain at that time. I was deeply, deeply in the closet, not sexuality wise, but gender wise. I couldn't have a name. I didn't have a name for what I was feeling inside. I was a really pious churchgoer to hide what I was feeling inside. So I was very happy to judge other people at the time. I was very homophobic, because just to hide, if you weren't a Christian, then you weren't as good as me. Basically, it was just to hide what I was struggling with myself. But it was never discussed. There was no word, like I said, there's no words like transgender. There's nothing like trans rights or anything like that. We just come out of Clause 28, so even gay even the gay community was vilified, was still slightly vilified and marginalised at that time. And so, like I said, I was going through pretending to be something that I was, trying to be somebody that I was. So I was basically trying to be a square peg in a round hole. I drew like a really scraggly beard and stuff like this. So, but I've always loved comics. So I was in the comic shop, and and I really got into Milestone. I loved a lot of those superheroes because it was different. It was more street smart. It was more like a reflection of what you could see out of your window. It was just so refreshing not to see all these white faces in a comic, to see people with more personality, where you had sort of other people's culture celebrated. And then there's a character called that came out in Hardware, which was like their version of Iron Man, and it was like this vigilante called Deathwish. And I thought, yeah, he's interesting. But then they released a miniseries about him, and it was different to the regular comics what I did, because their regular comics were done like on a matte, almost like just a bit better quality than newsprint. But this one was done on like a glossier paper. It had 30 it had 30 pages of story, and it was the first one that they did what was for mature audiences only. But what grabbed my eye, I had no idea what the subject matter was, but what grabbed my eye was the cover. It was by an artist I'd never heard of before. We're talking 1994. And it was an artist called J.H. Williams III. And I've done a bit of research since, and this was like his first major comics work that I did. It was his first major miniseries. Before then, he just did like a few piecemeal issues, one issue here, one issue there, about 2 or 3 comics total. So this was his first like chance at the big time with a major comic company with DC. And it was a 4-issue series, and it's called Deathwish. And that was the cover that caught my eye. And when I got it, like I said, it was the art that caught my eye, and I just took it home. Because I just flicked through, I literally flicked through it for about half a minute in the shop. I thought, yeah, this looks amazing. And it was written by somebody who's listed in here as Adam Blaustein. Now, their biggest claim to fame at that time was that in Marvel, they were the creators of the Power Pachyderms, which was Marvel's kind of attempt to do their version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I think. That's just an aside. But they were known as Adam Blaustein. But this was like their coming out story. And we've got to think, this is 1994, so we're talking 32 years ago now. Good God. And it's like the Punisher ramped up by 10. It's just much more hard hitting than the Punisher. So basically, Deathwish, this vigilante here, he only hunts down sex offenders. And in this story, you've got to remember this is set in the 90s, so some of the terminology and the language would make you grimace nowadays. There's this it's set, I think it's set in the gay part of town basically, and there's this so you've got all these different houses. So this is around the time when like you had your voguing houses, so they had different names, and one of the houses was called the House of Boots, I think it was. So they were called the Mother because they like oversaw their little group, and they had very stringent. Boots has very stringent policies. The people under their care has to look a certain way. They have to strive for perfection. But it turns out that Boots is quite sinister. Boots, it looks like they're a serial killer. So this opens up on the first page. It's set 5 years. It opens up the first page where it's set 5 years ago, and there's these 2 transgender women. Now I'm not sure if the Call Girl's not, but one of them's been brutally slain, and the other one is holding them in their arms. And this detective, and she's called Deanie, and this detective, it's the first time that they meet them. So I now move forward. Yeah, so he chases after, and you can tell even with it being a young J.H. Williams III, it's inked by Jimmy Palmiotti, but you can tell there's the germs of what J.H. Williams III becomes. So this detective gets caught by, this is Deathwish here, Deathwish mistakes him for the perpetrator who assaulted the 2 transgender women. And he says something quite telling. He says to him, so this detective recounting how he was 5 years ago, and he says he was reading me, and Deathwish says, "You're a cop, all right, kiddo, and maybe you haven't faced it yet, but you're also one of the girls. See you in hell." That parting shot there. And then it skips 5 years later, and the title of the first issue is "This Ain't No Crying Game," because at that time in the early 90s, the Crying Game had come out. And if you know the film, then you know how it's related to this. And it just shows this woman crossing the street. But if you notice, she's got similar glasses, trench coat, cigarette in her mouth. So you think you realise, she's a detective, but she is the detective from 5 years ago, and she's transitioned. So Deathwish had like this almost like supernatural element where he could read who they were really inside. So now it just sets up the scene, and it turns out there's more cases that have started happening. Now Deathwish is imprisoned, so that's Deathwish without the mask on. And it's very, you can tell that it's got a lot of the tropes from the 90s. So at the time, Silence of the Lambs was huge. So he's very much like a Hannibal Lecter kind of bad guy slash anti-hero. And so when they see Deathwish, they end up conversing with them. And on the next page, she recounts what's happened in the 5 years since they last saw Deathwish. So it says, this movie ran through my head 24/7. Right, so it shows that panel there where there's that girl, Deanie, who was assaulted, and Martin ends up visiting her all the time. And he says, then I met my Deanie. My life started after her attack at the warehouse. I'd give her flowers, she gave me her ears. Martin was a mess. She must have loved me even then. Don't know how she was able to put up with Martin's melancholy. She watched Martin die as I was being born. So now reading it, as you can see, I'm getting a bit emotional. Now reading it hits harder because as somebody who's transgender themselves, this is the transgender experience. You in denial so hard, and I was so fucking in denial. I was so far in the closet. I could see Narnia peeking out through the other side. And so this comic was like an awakening for me, which I repressed for a further 15 years. But that's by the by. So I was like, wow, there's people who are like me, even though, like I said, I was in denial. You know that river. And so the next page, it just shows, and what I like about it, it doesn't dwell on it too much. It just encapsulates it in 2 pages. So it shows how they transition from Martin to their new life, and how Deanie helped them find themselves. So Deanie has got this scar on her head from the serial killer who attacked, who was that's the one called Boots, who attacked her and her friend who got killed. So she recounts most of this to Deathwish, but apart from that bit, and then she says she didn't have to tell Deathwish that bit. He somehow knew that had happened. And then we move on to the next page, and this is Boots. Look at I mean, like I said, even then, we're talking 32 years ago, he still had the chops, even when he was starting out. So Boots is such a fantastic looking villain, proper serial killer vibes. And I love this page. I forgot how good it was. I've not looked at this comic since I last read it in 1994 because for some crazy reason it's never been collected, which is crazy when you think it's the first major work of J.H. Williams, but they never collected it. The reason I've only bought this one and not any others, I got it dirt cheap, is because it's now being collected, I think, in volume 3 or volume 4 of the Milestone compendiums. So I got the first compendium, so I will get those so I can read this fully. But I love this page. This shows Deathwish breaking out of the cell because he realizes Boots is on the rampage again. So I love that page. That panel is just so dynamic. He smashes the guard against the railings, gets his keys, and breaks out. So unlike the Punisher, he's got no qualms about hurting police officers if it means if he feels that anybody is hindering his quest to hunt down sexual offenders, woe betide them. You know, he'll rip through them as well, as it shows on this page. This is so savage. This is what I mean. It's the Punisher ramped up. The Punisher will not stand a chance against this guy. And he confronts confronts this person. It's just wonderful, the layouts. And that page, that panel there, I know I'm flipping about, who wraps that chain about it. He's always had this dynamism. It's funny, there seems much more energy in J.H. Williams' older artwork than what he's got now. There's much more of an elegance now. And I think he now looks at that to make the pages look pretty, whereas in this, it's more about the story beats. Like that panel there where it shows this scene setting here. Just in one panel, you know that they're in their house now. So the detectives now moved in with Dina. They've been together for 5 years. And she tells her on that page that Boots is out again. Boots is on the prowl again. And then you get the contrast of their living quarters to how Deathwish is living. He's basically living in this rat-infested apartment. It shows that. So it's got the railings there, the gun. And then there he is getting ready to be Deathwish. And so it flips now to the detective. And they follow a lead and they realise that Boots has escalated. So Boots has killed more transgender women. And then you've got the copper vomiting there. She chases after. And then you've got your nice little bit of transphobia there. What the hell are you supposed to be? Fortunately, she's stronger than that. She says, your worst nightmare, peck ahead. And I love this. She takes down these hoodlums all by herself. And the final page, I love this page. This should be a poster. The Deathwish is back. He's got his full regalia on and he's ready for hunting Boots. So that's it. I've only about this one because, like I say, I'm going to get the compendium. If you've never read Milestone, do buy the compendiums. They're very, very good value for money. They get thousands of pages in them. And like I said, I'm going to get the one which I'm going to get the next 3. I've got the first one, so I'm going to get the next 3 so I can read this whole as well. And there's just so many good strips in there. But a little bit more about, so J.H. Williams III, everybody knows. They've gone on to stellar things. They're one of the world's best comic artists now. But Maddie Blaustein, so they did name, I don't know if it was intentional because she was known as Adam Blaustein, but she was transitioning now. So I don't know if this was a fault of Milestone or whether she asked them to do that because people knew her as Adam Blaustein as a writer. Maybe this was, like I said, maybe this, in retrospect, maybe this was her way of letting people know that this is who she is now. But this was written by her and her partner, Yves, who was a transgender woman. And Yves is based, the character of Dini is based on her partner. And her partner helped her transition. But Maddie Blaustein then went, I think this was her final, she did another like follow-up to this in the pages of some Milestone comics. But this, after that, she didn't do any more comic work. She then moved on to be a voice actress. And she got really famous for being a big name voice actor for Pokemon in the cartoons. So that's where she made a career. And then sadly, unfortunately, about 15, 20 years ago, she passed away. She caught a virus and she passed away. The medication didn't work and she passed away. So a bit of a sad end note to it, but I'm so pleased that after 32 years, it's now being collected. Yeah, it's in a big compendium, but I don't mind. I love all the Milestone stuff. So everybody can now experience this comic that really fell under the radar. And I think DC at the time did not know how to cope with such a hot potato. There was no, I mean, this was 1995. I don't think there'd ever been a comic written by somebody who was transgender, like, and dealt with this topic at the time. I mean, people felt brave if they did stories about superheroes like North Star, who was gay. And even then, they played it down. If you're a gay character in comics back then, it just meant you went, "Oh, hello," and that was it. You didn't really dwell on what it means to be gay. So yeah, complete pioneer comic. Milestone has always been I said more of a pioneer comic than Vertigo. They pushed more boundaries than Vertigo ever did because they dealt more with social issues, whereas Vertigo is more the pretentious side. And they did Vertigo did question things like sexuality, gender identity, and other areas, but Milestone did it with a sledgehammer, and kudos to them. They'll always have a special place in my heart. So it's worth hunting down. You can get these um, on eBay and places like that. It was a 4-issue series, but like I said, I would highly recommend getting the compendiums instead. But it's just nice seeing early work by a fantastic artist, and to see that he even had the skill back then to illustrate dynamic comics. I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll hopefully do some more obscure comics soon. Bye.